The morning air felt cool and fresh as Emily Cooper stepped outside her family's home in the quiet neighborhood of Riverside Hills. She was a bright 8-year-old girl with long brown hair tied in pigtails and eyes that sparkled with joy whenever she played with her best friend Max. Max was not just any dog. He was a beautiful golden retriever with a coat that shined like honey in the sunlight and a personality that made everyone smile. Emily loved Saturday mornings more than any other day because her parents let her play outside as long as she wanted. She bounced down the front steps wearing her favorite pink sneakers and called out to Max, who was already waiting by the garden gate. The dog's tail moved back and forth so fast it looked like a golden blur. He barked happily and jumped up to greet his favorite human in the whole world. Their routine was always the same, and they both loved it. Emily would throw the old tennis ball that had lost most of its fuzzy green covering, and Max would chase after it like it was the most important thing in the universe. He would bring it back covered in drool and drop it at her feet waiting for the next throw. This simple game could go on for hours, and neither of them ever got tired of it. The street where they lived was usually very peaceful on weekend mornings. Most people were still sleeping or having breakfast inside their homes. The only sounds were birds singing in the trees and the distant hum of a lawnmower from somewhere down the block. Emily liked it this way because she and Max had the whole front yard to themselves without having to worry about cars or other distractions. Mr. Johnson from next door was watering his roses and waved at Emily. She waved back and threw the ball again, watching Max race across the grass with his ears flapping in the wind. Mrs. Patterson was sitting on her porch with a cup of coffee and smiled at the happy scene. Everyone in the neighborhood knew Emily and Max and often stopped to watch them play together. Their friendship was special and brought joy to anyone who saw them. As the morning went on, Emily noticed that Max was getting distracted by a butterfly that kept landing on the flowers near the sidewalk. The orange and black wings fluttered just out of reach, and Max would stop chasing the ball to watch it. Emily laughed at how funny he looked with his head tilted, and his ears perked up trying to figure out what this flying thing was. She decided to sit on the grass for a moment to catch her breath, and watched Max investigate the butterfly. The sun was climbing higher in the sky, and the day was getting warmer. Emily could smell someone cooking bacon from a nearby house, and her stomach made a small rumbling sound. She knew her mom would call her in for breakfast soon, but she wanted to play just a little bit longer. Max had given up on the butterfly and was now rolling in the grass, getting his golden fur covered in tiny pieces of cut grass. Emily giggled and tried to brush them off, but Max thought this was a new game and kept rolling around. Everything about this morning felt perfect and normal, just like every other Saturday. Emily had no idea that in just a few minutes her peaceful world would be turned upside down. She couldn't know that danger was approaching in the form of loud motorcycles and cruel people. All she knew was that she was happy playing with her best friend in the whole world on a beautiful morning. She threw the ball one more time and watched Max run after it with all the energy and joy that made him such a wonderful dog. The butterfly landed on a flower nearby, and everything seemed right with the world. The peaceful morning changed when a deep rumbling sound filled the air. It started as a distant noise, but grew louder and louder until it seemed to shake the very ground beneath Emily's feet. She looked up from where she sat on the grass and saw a group of motorcycles turning onto her street. There were 5 of them, all riding big black bikes that made thunderous noises as they moved. The riders wore leather jackets with strange symbols on the back, and their faces were hidden behind dark sunglasses. Leading the group was Derek Morrison, a man who had spent the morning drinking beer at the clubhouse with his biker friends. His eyes were red and watery from the alcohol, and his judgment was clouded by the drinks he had consumed since sunrise. Derek thought he owned every road he rode on, and believed that everyone should get out of his way. He gripped the handlebars of his motorcycle tightly and accelerated down the residential street, paying no attention to the speed limit signs that clearly said 25 miles per hour. The other bikers followed Derek closely, forming a line that took up most of the road. They were members of a motorcycle club called the Iron Devils, and they had a reputation for causing trouble wherever they went. People in other neighborhoods knew to stay inside when they heard the Iron Devils coming, but this was the first time they had ridden through Riverside Hills. The quiet suburban street was not prepared for their arrival. Emily felt a strange fear creeping into her stomach as she watched the motorcycles approach. Something about these men didn't feel right, and she instinctively moved closer to the front door of her house. Max was still playing near the edge of the yard, completely unaware of any danger. The golden retriever had spotted another butterfly and was following it with his tail wagging happily. The butterfly danced through the air, moving from flower to flower, with Max padding along behind it. Derek saw the dog near the street, and instead of slowing down, he sneered behind his sunglasses. He had always disliked dogs ever since one had bitten him as a child, and he often went out of his way to frighten them. The alcohol in his system made his cruel nature even worse, and a mean idea formed in his foggy mind. He revved his engine louder, making the motorcycle roar like an angry beast. The sound was meant to scare the dog, but Max was too focused on the butterfly to notice. The butterfly suddenly flew across the sidewalk toward the street, and Max followed without thinking. His paws left the safety of the grass and touched the hot pavement, just as Derek's motorcycle came speeding by. Emily saw what was happening and opened her mouth to scream Max's name, but the sound got stuck in her throat. Time seemed to slow down as she watched her best friend move into the path of the dangerous biker. Derek saw his chance and lifted his heavy boot from the footrest. His leg swung out in a vicious arc aimed directly at the innocent dog. The leather boot was reinforced with steel at the toe, making it a brutal weapon. Max finally heard the motorcycle and turned his head just as Derek's foot connected with his ribs. The impact was terrible and made a sound that Emily would never forget. The force of the kick sent Max flying through the air like a golden rag doll. The dog hit the pavement hard and rolled several times before coming to a stop near the curb. A high-pitched yelp of pain escaped from Max as he tried to understand what had happened. His body shook with shock, and his breathing came in short, painful gasps. Emily finally found her voice and screamed so loud that people came running out of their houses. Derek looked back over his shoulder and laughed at the scene he had created. He gave his motorcycle more gas and sped away with his gang following behind him. Their laughter mixed with the roar of engines as they disappeared around the corner, leaving destruction in their wake. Emily's scream pierced the morning air as she ran toward Max, who lay motionless on the hot pavement. Her small feet barely touched the ground as she raced to reach her beloved friend. Tears streamed down her face, making it hard to see, but she didn't care about anything except getting to Max. The golden retriever was trying to lift his head, but each movement caused him to whimper in pain. His beautiful golden fur was now dirty from rolling on the street, and his breathing was shallow and labored. Mrs. Patterson dropped her coffee cup on the porch, and it shattered into pieces as she hurried down her steps. Mr. Johnson threw down his garden hose and ran toward the street, still wearing his gardening gloves. Other neighbors began appearing from their houses, drawn by Emily's desperate cries. The peaceful Saturday morning had turned into a scene of chaos and concern as everyone rushed to help. Emily fell to her knees beside Max and gently placed her trembling hands on his head. She could feel him shaking, and his eyes looked up at her with confusion and pain. She wanted to pick him up and hold him, but was afraid she might hurt him more. Her voice broke as she whispered his name over and over, telling him everything would be okay, even though she wasn't sure it would be. Blood was starting to show through his fur where Derek's boot had struck, and Max's left side looked swollen. Emily's parents burst through the front door, having heard their daughter's screams from inside the house. Her mother, Sarah, gasped when she saw Max injured on the street, and her father, David, immediately pulled out his phone to call for help. He had the number for the emergency veterinary clinic saved, and his fingers shook as he dialed. Sarah knelt beside Emily and wrapped her arms around her daughter, who was now sobbing uncontrollably. While David spoke urgently on the phone, trying to explain what had happened, other neighbors gathered around, offering help. Someone brought a blanket to carefully slide under Max to make him more comfortable. Another neighbor ran to get water in case the dog was thirsty. Everyone was talking at once, sharing what they had seen and expressing their anger at the cruel vicar who had hurt an innocent animal. Just 3 houses down the street, a door opened, and a man stepped out to investigate the commotion. Jason Statham had been in the middle of his morning workout when the sounds of distress reached his home gym. Sweat glistened on his shaved head, and his muscles were still pumped from lifting weights. He wore simple gray sweatpants and a black tank top, but his presence immediately commanded attention as he walked purposefully toward the crowd. The famous action star had moved to Riverside Hills 6 months ago, seeking a quiet place to live between movie projects. He had chosen this neighborhood specifically because it seemed peaceful and family-friendly. Jason valued his privacy, but he couldn't ignore the obvious distress happening right outside his door. As he got closer, he could see a young girl crying over an injured dog, and his jaw tightened with concern. People stepped aside as Jason approached, recognizing the celebrity in their midst, but too worried about Max to make a fuss. Jason's trained eyes quickly assessed the situation, taking in the injured dog, the crying child, and the angry crowd. He had always been an animal lover, and seeing a defenseless pet hurt stirred something protective deep inside him. His own childhood dog had been his best friend, and he understood the bond between Emily and Max. Without hesitation, Jason knelt down beside the family, his strong presence somehow making everyone feel a little calmer. He spoke to Emily in a gentle voice, asking her name and telling her that Max was going to be okay. His confidence seemed to transfer to the frightened girl, who stopped crying long enough to tell him what had happened. As neighbors filled in the details about Derek and the Iron Devils, Jason's expression grew darker, and his fists clenched involuntarily. He had dealt with bullies his entire life, and someone who would hurt an innocent animal was the worst kind of bully in his book. Jason Statham listened carefully as the neighbors told him everything they had witnessed. His face remained calm, but his eyes showed a burning anger that made everyone step back slightly. He had played tough characters in movies, but this was real life, and his protective instincts were genuine. When Mrs. Patterson described how Derek had deliberately kicked Max and then laughed about it, Jason's jaw muscles tightened even more. David Cooper ended his phone call and announced that the emergency vet clinic was ready to receive Max immediately. The problem was getting the injured dog there safely without causing more pain. Jason stood up and looked at the family car parked in the driveway, then made a quick decision. He told David to get the car ready while he would help carry Max. His years of physical training had prepared him for moments like this, and he knew exactly how to lift the dog without hurting him further. With gentle movements that surprised everyone who knew him only from his action roles, Jason slid his arms under Max's body. He spoke softly to the dog, telling him he was safe now and that they were going to get help. Max whimpered but seemed to understand that this strong man was trying to help. Emily stayed close, touching Max's head and telling him how brave he was being. Sarah grabbed blankets from the house to make a soft bed in the back seat of their car. As Jason carefully lifted Max, the golden retriever's weight seemed like nothing in his powerful arms. He moved slowly and smoothly, making sure not to jar the injured ribs. Other neighbors held doors open and cleared the path to the car. Once Max was settled on the blankets in the back seat, Emily climbed in beside him, refusing to leave his side. Jason leaned into the car and told Emily she was being very brave and that Max was lucky to have such a caring friend. Before the Coopers drove away, Jason pulled David aside and handed him a business card. He told him to call his personal assistant and that all of Max's medical bills would be covered. David started to protest, but Jason raised his hand and said this was not up for discussion. He explained that no family should have to worry about money when their pet was hurt, especially when it happened because of someone's cruelty. Sarah overheard, and tears of gratitude filled her eyes as she thanked him. As the Cooper family rushed off to the vet clinic, Jason stood in the street surrounded by angry neighbors. Everyone was talking about the Iron Devils and how they had been causing problems in nearby towns for months. Mr. Johnson mentioned that the bikers usually hung out at a bar called the Rusty Chain on the outskirts of town. Others added that Derek Morrison was known as the leader and that he had a reputation for violence and bullying. Jason absorbed all this information without saying much, but his mind was working quickly. He had connections throughout the city from his years of living and working there. He pulled out his phone and made several calls, speaking in short, precise sentences. First, he called a friend who worked in the police department, asking about the Iron Devils and their recent activities. Then he contacted a private investigator he had used before for security matters. Within minutes, he had gathered more intelligence about Derek Morrison than the biker would have thought possible. The neighbors watched in fascination as the action star they had only seen on screen became a real-life hero, coordinating a response to the attack on Max. Some people started sharing videos they had taken on their phones when they heard the commotion. One neighbor had security camera footage that clearly showed Derek kicking the dog. Jason asked for copies of everything and promised that justice would be served. He thanked everyone for their help and headed back to his house with a determined look on his face. The morning workout was forgotten as he began planning his next moves. Derek Morrison had no idea that his cruel act had just made him the enemy of one of Hollywood's toughest action stars, and that karma was about to catch up with him in ways he never imagined. The Rusty Chain Bar looked exactly like the kind of place where tough bikers would hang out. Paint peeled from the wooden walls, and neon beer signs flickered in the dirty windows. The parking lot was full of motorcycles, all lined up like soldiers ready for battle. Inside the bar was dark and smoky, with loud rock music blasting from old speakers. The smell of stale beer and cigarettes filled the air, making it hard to breathe. Jason Statham sat in his car across the street, studying the building carefully. He had changed out of his workout clothes and now wore dark jeans and a leather jacket that helped him blend in. His military training from years ago kicked in as he observed the comings and goings of various bikers. He counted at least 15 motorcycles, including the 5 he had been told belonged to the Iron Devils. The private investigator had confirmed that this was indeed their favorite hangout spot. Night had fallen, and the bar was getting busier. Jason had spent the afternoon gathering more information about Derek Morrison and his gang. What he learned made his anger grow even stronger. Derek had a long history of violence and intimidation, but had always managed to avoid serious jail time. He picked on people who couldn't fight back and used his gang to threaten anyone who tried to stand up to him. The attack on Max was just the latest in a long list of cruel acts. Jason checked his phone one more time. The Coopers had sent him a message saying that Max was stable but would need surgery on his ribs. The vet was optimistic about his recovery, but it would be a long and painful process. Emily had refused to leave Max's side at the clinic and was sleeping on a cot next to his cage. The photo Sarah had sent showed the little girl holding Max's paw through the cage bars, and it made Jason's resolve even stronger. Taking a deep breath, Jason got out of his car and walked across the street to the bar. He pushed open the heavy wooden door and stepped inside, letting his eyes adjust to the dim lighting. The conversation stopped for a moment as people noticed the stranger, but then resumed when they didn't recognize him as a threat. Jason made his way to the bar and ordered a beer, keeping his head slightly down, but his senses alert. Derek Morrison sat at a table in the back corner, surrounded by his fellow Iron Devils. He was telling the story of kicking the dog for the 5th time that day, and his buddies were laughing like it was the funniest thing they had ever heard. Derek took another swig of beer and embellished the story, adding details about how the dog had flown through the air. He was clearly proud of what he had done and showed no sign of remorse. Jason sipped his beer slowly and listened to every word. His acting skills came in handy as he pretended to be just another customer, while secretly studying Derek and his gang. He noticed their positions in the room and identified potential exits. The other patrons gave the Iron Devils plenty of space, clearly knowing their reputation for violence. The bartender looked nervous whenever he had to serve them more drinks. After an hour of observation, Jason decided it was time to act. He finished his beer and walked directly toward Derek's table. The bikers noticed him approaching and their laughter died down. Derek looked up with bloodshot eyes and sneered at the stranger walking toward them. He was about to make a smart comment when recognition slowly dawned on his face. His mouth dropped open as he realized he was looking at Jason Statham, the action movie star. The other Iron Devils shifted nervously in their seats. They might act tough, but even they knew Jason's reputation for being genuinely skilled in martial arts. Derek tried to recover his composure and forced a laugh, asking if the movie star was lost. Jason didn't smile as he stood at their table, his presence commanding attention despite being outnumbered. The entire bar had gone quiet as people sensed something was about to happen. Jason's voice was calm but carried an edge of steel as he said he had heard about what happened to a certain golden retriever that morning, and he was there to discuss it with Derek personally. Derek Morrison tried to laugh off Jason's presence, but the sound came out forced and nervous. He looked around at his fellow Iron Devils, hoping they would back him up, but even they seemed unsure about confronting the famous action star. Derek stood up from his chair, trying to use his height advantage, but Jason remained perfectly calm and unimpressed. The tension in the bar was so thick that even the music seemed to fade into the background. Jason's voice was steady and controlled as he spoke about Max and Emily and how devastated the little girl was about her injured dog. He described the surgery Max needed and the long recovery ahead. Every word was delivered with precision, making Derek squirm uncomfortably. The other bar patrons watched in fascination as the Hollywood star faced down the notorious biker leader. Some people quietly took out their phones to record what was happening. Derek's face grew red with embarrassment and anger. He wasn't used to being called out, especially not in front of his gang. He tried to act tough, saying it was just a stupid dog and that Emily needed to keep her pet out of the street. This response made Jason's eyes narrow dangerously. He stepped closer to Derek, closing the distance between them until they were face to face. The actor's presence was intimidating without him having to raise his voice or make any threatening gestures. The conversation might have ended there if Derek hadn't made a fatal mistake. Fueled by alcohol and wounded pride, he suddenly threw a wild punch at Jason's face. It was a clumsy move telegraphed from a mile away. Jason's reflexes kicked in automatically. He tilted his head slightly, letting the punch sail past, then grabbed Derek's wrist in a grip like iron. In one smooth motion, he twisted the arm and used Derek's own momentum to flip him over onto a nearby table, which collapsed under the impact. Derek hit the floor hard with broken table pieces scattered around him. He groaned and tried to get up, but Jason placed one foot gently but firmly on his chest, keeping him down. The entire exchange had taken less than 3 seconds. The other Iron Devils started to rise from their seats, but Jason held up his free hand in a stop gesture. His reputation and the display of skill they had just witnessed made them freeze in place. Jason looked down at Derek, who was gasping for breath, and finally understanding he was completely outmatched. The actor spoke clearly enough for everyone in the bar to hear. He explained that he had already given security footage of the dog attack to the police and that animal cruelty charges would be filed. He had also contacted local news stations who were very interested in the story of a biker gang leader who kicked a child's pet. Derek's eyes widened as he realized his reputation was about to be destroyed. But Jason wasn't finished with his lesson. He told Derek that he had 2 choices. He could accept the consequences of his actions with dignity, or he could continue being a bully and face further humiliation. Jason removed his foot and helped Derek sit up, showing that he could be merciful as well as tough. The defeated biker looked around at his gang members who were avoiding his gaze. Even they seemed disgusted by his actions, now that they had been confronted with the reality of what he had done. The bartender, who had been watching nervously, finally found his voice and suggested that the Iron Devils might want to leave for the night. Other regular customers murmured in agreement. The tide had turned against Derek and his gang. They had terrorized this bar and many others for too long, and seeing their leader taken down so easily gave everyone courage. Derek struggled to his feet, holding his bruised ribs where he had hit the table. He couldn't even look Jason in the eye as he motioned for his gang to follow him out. As the Iron Devils filed out of the bar in shame, Jason called out one more thing. He told Derek that he expected a genuine apology to be delivered to the Cooper family and a donation to be made to the local animal shelter. If Derek wanted any chance of reducing the legal consequences he faced, he would need to show real remorse and change. The beaten biker nodded miserably and limped out into the night, knowing his reign of intimidation was over. Retruius. The news of Jason Statham confronting the Iron Devil spread through the town like wildfire. By the next morning, every local news station was running the story about how the action star had stood up for an injured dog and faced down a notorious biker gang. Social media exploded with videos from the bar showing Jason's swift takedown of Derek Morrison. People who had been afraid of the Iron Devils for years suddenly felt empowered to speak up about their own experiences with the gang's bullying. Derek Morrison woke up in his apartment with a splitting headache and bruised ribs. His phone had been ringing non-stop with calls from angry Iron Devils members who blamed him for their humiliation. The gang's reputation was in ruins, and several members had already announced they were leaving. Derek looked at himself in the mirror and saw not a tough biker leader, but a pathetic bully who had been exposed for what he really was. At the animal hospital, Max was showing signs of improvement after his surgery. Emily had stayed by his side all night, refusing to go home, even when her parents tried to convince her to get some rest. The golden retriever's tail gave a weak wag when he saw his young friend, and Emily's face lit up with hope. The vet explained that Max would need several weeks of recovery, but the surgery had been successful thanks to Jason's financial support. Jason arrived at the hospital later that morning carrying a huge basket of dog toys and treats. He also brought a teddy bear for Emily, who was starting to look exhausted from her vigil. When he entered Max's recovery room, Emily jumped up and hugged him tightly, thanking him over and over for helping her best friend. Jason knelt down to Max's level and gently stroked the dog's head, speaking softly about how brave he was being. The Cooper family was overwhelmed by Jason's kindness. Not only had he covered all the medical expenses, but he had also arranged for a specialized animal physical therapist to help with Max's recovery. Sarah Cooper tried to express her gratitude, but found herself getting emotional. David shook Jason's hand firmly and said they would never forget what he had done for their family. Jason brushed off the thanks, saying anyone would have done the same thing. Meanwhile, the police had arrested Derek Morrison on animal cruelty charges. The security footage was clear evidence, and with the media attention on the case, prosecutors were taking it very seriously. Derek's lawyer advised him to plead guilty and show remorse if he wanted to avoid jail time. The once proud biker leader found himself facing fines, community service, and the complete destruction of his reputation. The Iron Devils officially disbanded as members distanced themselves from their toxic leader. Local animal rights groups organized a protest outside the courthouse demanding justice for Max. People who had never spoken up before shared stories of animals being mistreated and called for stronger laws to protect pets. The mayor announced the creation of a new task force to address animal cruelty in the community. What had started as one cruel act was turning into a movement for positive change. Jason used his platform to raise awareness about animal cruelty. He posted updates about Max's recovery on social media and encouraged his millions of followers to support local animal shelters. Donations poured in from around the world, and several celebrities joined the cause. The story of Max and Emily touched hearts everywhere and became a symbol of standing up against bullies who preyed on the innocent. 3 weeks after the attack, Max was finally strong enough to go home. Jason arranged for a special welcome home party in the Coopers' front yard. Neighbors gathered with balloons and signs celebrating Max's recovery. When the car pulled up and Emily helped Max out, everyone cheered. The golden retriever's tail wagged enthusiastically despite his healing ribs, and he barked happily at all the attention. It was a far cry from that terrible morning when he had been hurt on this very street. 6 months passed since the terrible incident that had shaken the quiet neighborhood of Riverside Hills. The seasons changed from summer to winter, and the trees that lined Emily's street were now bare of leaves. Max had made a complete recovery, and was back to his playful self chasing tennis balls and butterflies with the same enthusiasm as before. His golden fur had grown back thick and shiny, and only a small scar remained as evidence of his ordeal. Derek Morrison's life had taken a very different turn during those same months. After pleading guilty to animal cruelty charges, he was sentenced to 200 hours of community service at the local animal shelter. At first, Derek had shown up angry and resentful, counting down the hours until this punishment would be over. He avoided the animals and did only the minimum work required, while the shelter staff watched him with distrust. The shelter manager was a tough woman named Margaret who had worked with animals for 30 years. She saw through Derek's tough exterior and recognized someone who needed to learn empathy. Instead of giving him easy tasks like filing paperwork, she assigned him to work directly with the animals. Derek found himself cleaning kennels, feeding dogs, and even helping with basic medical care under supervision. Something unexpected happened as Derek spent more time at the shelter. He began to notice how each animal had its own personality and story. There was a pit bull named Rocky who had been used for fighting, but still wagged his tail whenever humans approached. A cat named Whiskers had been abandoned, but purred loudly when anyone showed her attention. These animals had every reason to distrust humans, yet they still showed love and forgiveness. One day, a golden retriever was brought to the shelter after being hit by a car. The dog reminded Derek of Max, and suddenly all his guilt came flooding back. He volunteered to help care for the injured dog, staying after his required hours to make sure it was comfortable. Margaret watched in surprise as the former biker showed genuine concern for the animal's well-being. It was the first crack in the wall Derek had built around his heart. As weeks turned into months, Derek's transformation became more apparent. He started arriving early for his community service and staying late to help with whatever was needed. He learned the names of all the animals and their individual needs. Other volunteers began to accept him as he proved his commitment was real. The angry biker who had kicked Max was slowly being replaced by someone who understood the value of compassion. The real test came when a family brought in a dog that had been abused by its previous owner. The animal cowered in the corner of its kennel, afraid of any human contact. Derek saw himself in the dog's fear and realized he had been the kind of person who caused such trauma. He spent hours sitting quietly outside the kennel, reading aloud from a book and letting the dog get used to his presence without any pressure. Gradually, the frightened animal began to trust Derek. It would creep closer when he brought food and eventually allowed him to pet its head gently. The breakthrough moment came when the dog finally wagged its tail at Derek's approach. Margaret witnessed this and knew the transformation was complete. The man who had once kicked a dog for fun was now helping traumatized animals learn to trust again. Derek wrote a sincere letter of apology to the Cooper family, explaining how working at the shelter had opened his eyes. He included a donation to Max's favorite animal charity and promised to dedicate his life to making amends for his past cruelty. The letter arrived just as the first snow of winter began to fall, and Emily read it aloud to Max, who listened with his head tilted as if understanding every word. The community center in Riverside Hills was decorated with colorful balloons and streamers for the special event taking place on this sunny spring afternoon. 1 year had passed since Max's injury, and the neighborhood had decided to organize a celebration that would honor both the recovery and the positive changes that had followed. Families filled the room with children running around excitedly, while their parents set up tables loaded with homemade food and treats. Emily walked in holding Max's leash proudly as the golden retriever pranced beside her, wearing a special blue bandana that read "Survivor" in glittering letters. Max's tail never stopped wagging as people reached down to pet him and tell him what a good boy he was. Emily beamed with joy, seeing her best friend healthy and happy again, receiving all the attention he deserved after his long recovery journey. Jason Statham arrived fashionably late, but his entrance caused quite a stir among the crowd. He had continued to stay in touch with the Cooper family throughout Max's recovery and had become something of a local hero in Riverside Hills. Children gathered around him asking for autographs while their parents thanked him again for standing up against the bikers. Jason remained humble, deflecting praise and insisting that anyone would have done the same thing in his position. The surprise guest of the afternoon was Derek Morrison, who entered quietly through a side door. He looked completely different from the rough biker everyone remembered. Gone were the leather jacket and threatening demeanor, replaced by clean clothes and a nervous but genuine smile. He carried a large donation box for the animal shelter, where he now worked full-time after completing his community service. Many people did double takes, not believing this was the same man who had caused so much pain. Margaret from the animal shelter accompanied Derek and spoke to the crowd about his remarkable transformation. She explained how he had gone from reluctant volunteer to dedicated animal advocate, working extra hours without pay and even adopting 2 rescue dogs of his own. Derek had become one of their most valuable employees, specializing in rehabilitating abused animals, using his own story as inspiration for change. The moment everyone had been waiting for came when Derek approached the Cooper family. Emily stood protectively near Max, unsure how to react to the man who had hurt her friend. Derek knelt down to Emily's level and spoke softly, apologizing directly to her and Max for his terrible actions. He explained how working with animals had taught him about love and responsibility, and how he wished he could take back that awful morning. Max seemed to sense the sincerity and surprised everyone by walking over to sniff Derek's outstretched hand. Sarah Cooper wiped tears from her eyes as she watched her daughter process this moment. Emily looked at her parents, then at Jason, who gave her an encouraging nod. Finally, she told Derek that while she could never forget what happened, she was glad he had changed and was helping other animals now. The room erupted in applause as Derek stood up, emotional but grateful for the chance at redemption he had been given. The celebration continued with Jason announcing the creation of the Max Foundation, a charity dedicated to preventing animal cruelty and supporting pet medical expenses for families in need. He had partnered with local businesses and celebrities to ensure no family would have to choose between their pet's health and their finances. The foundation's first major project would be building a new animal hospital in Riverside Hills with state-of-the-art equipment. As the sun began to set, the party moved outside, where children played games and dogs ran freely in the fenced yard. Emily threw Max's favorite tennis ball, watching him race after it with all his old energy and joy. Derek sat on a bench with his 2 rescue dogs, teaching them tricks, while Margaret looked on proudly. Jason signed autographs and posed for pictures, but kept returning to check on the Cooper family, who had become genuine friends. The story that began with cruelty and violence had transformed into something beautiful. A community had come together to protect the innocent and create lasting change. Max's suffering had not been in vain, as it sparked a movement that would help countless animals for years to come. As Emily hugged Max close that evening, she whispered in his ear that he wasn't just a good boy, he was a hero who had made the world a better place.